The United States government just crossed a line that should terrify every American. On October 23, 2025, the national debt officially surpassed $38 trillion for the first time in human history. That's not a typo. $38 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's twice the entire economic output of the European Union, more than 20 times Great Britain's annual budget, and a crushing $500,000 burden for every young American under 18 years old. But here's what should keep you awake at night. They're not planning to pay it back. Not through spending cuts, not through higher taxes, not through economic growth. They're planning something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous. They're going to make it disappear using a financial mechanism that most people think is separate from government policy. And when they execute this strategy, every dollar you've saved, every bond you own, every pension you're counting on will lose massive purchasing power while the government's debt burden evaporates into thin air. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented policy. The mechanisms are already in motion. The president exists, and the timeline is accelerating faster than anyone wants to admit. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how the United States government is preparing to eliminate $38 trillion in debt without paying back a single penny through the most sophisticated wealth transfer in American history. You're about to witness financial engineering on a scale never before attempted. And when it's over, the middle class will have paid for it all without ever knowing what hit them. Welcome to Finance Historian. Here we break down global finance. Just a quick reminder before we get started. Smash the like button and subscribe if you love financial deep dives. Comment your city and the time you're watching this. I want to see how global this community is. Let me start with a number that will make your head spin. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the federal government has been accumulating debt at a rate of $69,713.82 per second for the past year. Every second. While you slept last night, the debt grew by over $6 million. While you watch this video start, it's already grown by hundreds of thousands more. This isn't gradual decline. This is exponential acceleration toward a mathematical impossibility. The debt reached $37 trillion in August 2025. Just 2 months later, it hit $38 trillion. That's $1 trillion in 60 days. Outside of the COVID pandemic, this represents the fastest accumulation of debt in American history. But here's where it gets truly insane. The Congressional Budget Office projects the debt will surpass $40 trillion in 2027. That's just 2 years away. We're adding $10 trillion every 5 years. Now, the velocity is increasing, not slowing down. And this is happening while the economy is supposedly strong. Unemployment is low. GDP is growing. Corporate profits are solid. If we're adding debt this fast during good times, what happens when the next recession hits? What happens when unemployment spikes and tax revenues collapse, while spending on unemployment benefits and social programs explodes? The math doesn't just stop working. It becomes mathematically impossible. But raw debt numbers only tell part of the story. The real crisis is hiding in plain sight in the federal budget. Interest payments on the national debt have become the fastest growing component of government spending. In fiscal year 2025, the United States paid over $1 trillion just in interest. Not principal, just interest. To put that in context, that's more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than any single government program except Social Security. Think about what this means. Nearly 1 in every $5 that taxpayers send to Washington buys absolutely nothing of value. No roads, no schools, no defense, no healthcare, just interest payments to bondholders. It's like making minimum payments on a credit card that keeps growing faster than you can pay it down. Except this credit card belongs to the most powerful nation on earth, and the consequences of default would reshape the global financial system. The average interest rate on the total marketable national debt is currently 3.38%. That's up from 1.58% just 5 years ago. When interest rates rise, the government's borrowing costs explode. And with $38 trillion in debt, every percentage point increase in interest rates adds $380 billion in annual interest payments. The Federal Reserve has been trying to bring down inflation by raising interest rates. But those same rate increases are making the debt crisis exponentially worse. Here's the trap the government has created for itself. They need to keep borrowing to pay the interest on existing debt. But the more they borrow, the higher interest rates go because bond buyers demand higher returns for the increased risk. Higher interest rates make the debt more expensive to service, which requires more borrowing, which pushes rates even higher. This is called a debt spiral. And once it starts, it's almost impossible to stop through normal fiscal policy. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest costs will rise from $4 trillion over the past decade to $14 trillion over the next 10 years. That's not a gradual increase. That's an explosion. Within 10 years, the government will be spending more on interest than on defense, Medicare, and education combined. The budget will become nothing but interest payments and Social Security. Everything else will be squeezed out. But here's what the government knows that most Americans don't understand. They have a nuclear option, a way to eliminate debt without actually paying it back. It's called debt monetization, and it's been used by governments throughout history when conventional fiscal policy fails. The process is elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. Debt monetization works like this. Instead of borrowing money from private investors by selling bonds, the government borrows directly from the central bank. The Federal Reserve creates new money out of thin air and uses that newly created money to buy government bonds. The government gets the cash it needs to operate. The Federal Reserve gets bonds that pay interest, and the money supply increases by exactly the amount of new debt created. This is often called printing money, though no actual printing is involved in the digital age. The Federal Reserve simply creates electronic reserves and credits them to the Treasury's account. From the government's perspective, it's free money. They get to spend without having to raise taxes or cut programs. The debt technically still exists on the balance sheet, but it's owed to the Federal Reserve, which is essentially owned by the government itself. The profits from Federal Reserve security holdings get sent back to the Treasury anyway. So, the government is essentially paying interest to itself. It's like taking money out of your left pocket and putting it in your right pocket while claiming you've paid off your credit card. The accounting shows the debt is being serviced, but no real wealth has changed hands. This mechanism has already been tested on a massive scale. During the 2008 financial crisis and again during the COVID pandemic, the Federal Reserve purchased trillions of dollars in government bonds through programs called quantitative easing. They claimed these purchases were temporary and designed to stabilize financial markets. But the effect was identical to debt monetization. The government borrowed money that was created out of nothing by the central bank. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion at its peak in 2021. That's $8 trillion in newly created money used to purchase government and corporate bonds. Without these purchases, the government would have had to find private buyers. For all that debt, interest rates would have been much higher. The fiscal crisis would have arrived much sooner. But quantitative easing was sold as emergency policy, temporary measures during extraordinary times. The Federal Reserve insisted they were not monetizing debt because they were buying bonds in secondary markets rather than directly from the Treasury. This distinction is purely cosmetic. When the central bank removes trillions of dollars in bonds from private markets, it creates artificial demand that allows the government to borrow at artificially low rates. Now the emergency is over, but the mechanism remains in place. On December 10, 2025, the Federal Reserve announced plans to purchase $40 billion worth of Treasury bills per month starting December 12. They're calling these reserve management purchases, carefully distinguishing them from quantitative easing, but the effect is identical. The Fed is creating new money to buy government debt. This is the setup for the largest debt elimination scheme in American history. The pieces are moving into position for a controlled demolition of the dollar's purchasing power that will transfer wealth from savers to debtors on an unprecedented scale. Here's what they're not telling you about modern monetary theory. This isn't some fringe economic idea cooked up by professors in ivory towers. This is the operating philosophy that's quietly taken over Washington's approach to debt and spending. And it's about to be deployed on a scale that will fundamentally alter the American economy. Modern monetary theory makes one simple but revolutionary claim. A government that issues its own currency can never truly go broke because it can always create more money to pay its debts. Under this framework, the $38 trillion debt isn't actually a problem. It's just numbers on a spreadsheet. The government doesn't need to find the money to pay back bonds. It can simply create the money when those bonds come due. This sounds insane to anyone raised on traditional economics. We're taught that debt must be repaid with real value, that you can't just print money to solve financial problems without consequences. But MMT economists argue this thinking is outdated when applied to sovereign governments. They claim the United States proved this theory works during the COVID pandemic when it created trillions of dollars out of nothing without triggering hyperinflation. The defining feature of modern monetary theory is its insistence that there's no upper limit on government borrowing as long as the debt is denominated in the country's own currency. Since every dollar of U.S. debt is owed in dollars, and since the United States controls the creation of dollars, the debt can theoretically grow forever without risk of default. The government can always print enough dollars to make interest payments. Under this framework, the only real constraint on government spending is inflation. If creating too much money causes prices to rise too quickly, the government should reduce spending or raise taxes to pull excess money out of the economy. But as long as inflation remains manageable, there's no reason to worry about debt levels that would have terrified economists just 20 years ago. This theory isn't just academic anymore. It's becoming policy. When the Federal Reserve purchased trillions in government bonds during recent crisis, they were implementing MMT principles, whether they admitted it or not. When the government spent $6 trillion on COVID relief without any plan to pay it back through taxes or spending cuts, that was MMT in action. The debt was simply monetized through Federal Reserve purchases. But here's what MMT advocates don't emphasize when they sell this theory to policymakers. Monetizing debt doesn't eliminate it. It transfers the cost from the government to everyone who holds dollars. When the central bank creates new money to buy government bonds, it increases the money supply. More dollars chasing the same goods and services means each individual dollar becomes worth less. The debt disappears from the government's practical obligations, but its value gets extracted from every dollar in existence. This is the most sophisticated theft mechanism ever devised. It's completely legal. It doesn't require legislation or voter approval. It happens through technical monetary policy that most people don't understand. And it transfers wealth from savers to the government without anyone realizing they've been robbed until it's too late. The process has already begun. The Federal Reserve IA's recent announcement of $40 billion in monthly Treasury purchases is just the opening move. They're testing the waters, seeing if markets accept the return of large-scale bond buying without triggering panic. If this initial phase goes smoothly, the purchases will expand. $40 billion per month becomes $80 billion, then $120 billion. Before long, the Federal Reserve is purchasing most new government debt issuance. But the government needs more than just debt monetization to make $38 trillion disappear. They need a mechanism that makes the theft look like sound fiscal policy, something that gives them political cover while they destroy the purchasing power of every dollar in existence. That mechanism is strategic asset revaluation, and it's happening right now through cryptocurrency and gold policy. The government currently holds approximately 210,000 Bitcoins seized from criminal enterprises. At current prices around $100,000 per coin, that's $21 billion in digital assets. Not enough to matter for a $38 trillion debt problem. But the government isn't planning to value Bitcoin at current market prices. They're positioning to revalue it at multiples of current prices through official reserve policy. Here's how the revaluation mechanism works. The government announces that Bitcoin will be held as a strategic reserve asset, similar to gold in Fort Knox. They declare that for balance sheet purposes, Bitcoin will be valued not at market prices, but at strategic reserve prices. If they announce Bitcoin is worth $500,000 per coin for government accounting purposes, their 210,000 Bitcoin suddenly becomes worth $15 billion on paper. They've created $84 billion in balance sheet value simply by changing the accounting price. This isn't speculation. It's exactly what the government did with gold in 1934. President Roosevelt revalued gold from $2,067 per ounce to $35 per ounce overnight. The government's gold reserves increased in value by 69% without acquiring a single additional ounce. That revaluation created billions in balance sheet value that was used to offset government debt during the Great Depression. The same mechanism is being prepared for gold today. The United States officially holds 8,133 tons of gold valued on government books at $422 per ounce. That's the statutory price set in 1973, not current market prices of $2,800 per ounce. This creates enormous room for revaluation. If the government announces gold will be valued at $10,000 per ounce for reserve purposes, their gold holdings jump from $11 billion on the books to over $2 trillion overnight. Combined with Bitcoin revaluation, the government could create several trillion dollars in balance sheet assets through nothing more than accounting changes. This gives them the appearance of fiscal strength while they monetize debt through Federal Reserve purchases. The books show valuable assets offsetting debt obligations. The reality is that they've simply changed the numbers while inflating away the debt's real value. The international implications of this strategy extend far beyond domestic policy. Foreign governments hold approximately $7 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. When the United States monetizes debt and revalues strategic assets, those foreign holdings lose purchasing power in real terms. Countries that trusted U.S. bonds as safe stores of value discover they've been paid back in devalued currency. This is why we're seeing accelerated movement away from dollar reserves among major economies. China reduced its treasury holdings by over 100 billion in 2024. Russia eliminated most of its dollar reserves after 2022. Saudi Arabia is accepting Chinese yuan for oil payments instead of requiring dollars. These aren't random policy decisions. These countries see the debt monetization strategy coming, and they're positioning their economies accordingly. The BRICS nations have launched alternative payment systems specifically designed to bypass the dollar-dominated financial system. China and India are conducting trade in local currencies. Brazil is using its real for regional transactions. Russia conducts 90% of its BRICS trade in local currencies rather than dollars. This dollarization movement isn't driven by political hostility alone. It's driven by economic self-preservation. As the United States prepares to inflate away its debt obligations, central banks worldwide are purchasing gold at record levels because they understand what's coming. The World Gold Council reported that central bank gold purchases reached the highest levels in decades during 2024 and 2025. China's central bank bought gold for 11 consecutive months through September 2025, bringing total reserves to over $280 billion in gold value. These purchases aren't random diversification. They're preparation for a monetary system where the dollar's purchasing power has been deliberately destroyed. The electric vehicle revolution poses an additional threat to dollar dominance through the breakdown of the petrodollar system. 1 in 4 cars sold globally in 2025 will be electric. Oil demand is projected to stagnate after 2026 and potentially decline by 2030 as electric vehicle adoption accelerates. Reduced oil trade means fewer transactions requiring dollar settlement, weakening the mechanism that has supported dollar demand for 50 years. When countries no longer need dollars to purchase energy, when alternative payment systems allow trade without dollar intermediation, when central banks hold gold instead of treasury bonds, the demand for dollars collapses. All those dollars held overseas come flooding back to the United States. The money supply expands not just through domestic money creation, but through the return of dollars that were previously held abroad. This amplifies the inflationary impact of debt monetization by potentially doubling or tripling the effective money supply increase. The government knows this timeline is compressed. They have perhaps 5 to 10 years before dollarization reaches critical mass and international dollar demand collapses completely. That's why the debt monetization and asset revaluation strategies are being implemented now. While the dollar still maintains reserve currency status, once that status is lost, the ability to export inflation through monetary expansion disappears. The United States would face the same constraints as any other country with unsustainable debt levels, sustainable debt levels. The timeline for this financial reset isn't theoretical. It's operational. Every piece is moving into position for what economists are quietly calling the Great Repricing. The mechanisms aren't hidden in classified documents. They're visible in Federal Reserve policy statements, Treasury announcements, and Congressional Budget Office projections. The government is broadcasting their intentions to anyone who understands the language of monetary policy. Within 18 months, you will see the Federal Reserve Bruce's monthly Treasury purchases expand from $40 billion to $100 billion. They'll justify this expansion as necessary to maintain market stability and ensure adequate bank reserves. The media will report it as responsible monetary management. But what's really happening is the systematic monetization of government debt on a scale that makes previous quantitative easing programs look like practice runs. By 2027, when debt hits $40 trillion, the government will face a choice that isn't really a choice at all. They can either default on their obligations, triggering a global financial catastrophe that would destroy American political and economic power permanently, or they can implement the full debt monetization strategy, while international dollar demand still provides cover for massive monetary expansion. The choice has already been made. The $38 trillion debt will vanish through the most sophisticated wealth transfer in American history. Every mechanism is operational. Every timeline is accelerating. And every dollar you hold will pay the price. The only question left is whether you will recognize the theft while it's happening or wake up one morning to discover your savings bought half of what they did the year before. The Great Repricing begins.